Ukraine's post-revolution coalition is put to the test as the Prime Minister quits. Arseny Yatsenyuk stands accused of failing to push through essential economic reforms. But can a new Prime Minister deliver? And how will Ukraine's Western backers react? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Prime Minister Arseny Yatsenyuk led Ukraine through turbulent times for the past 2 years. He survived the loss of Crimea to Russia in 2014, a deepening rift with President Petro Poroshenko and a no-confidence vote in February. But now Yatsenyuk is stepping down. He says he hopes his departure will help the country refocus on necessary reforms.
The political crisis in the country was created artificially. The desire to change one person blinded politicians and paralysed their political will for real change. The process of changing the government turned into a mindless running in place. The authors of the crisis became hostages to these circumstances and hold all of us hostage: the government, society and the state.
Well, Yatsenyuk steps down from office with his popularity down in the single digits, which follows a months-long economic crisis. The World Bank says Ukraine's economy fell by around 10% last year. Its currency has lost about 20% of its value in recent weeks. And the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has been withholding around $17.5 billion in loans because of political infighting and alleged corruption. Let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Kiev, we have Valentin Koushik, Professor of Political Science at the University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy. From Moscow, we have Vladimir Mikheyev, independent analyst at the Troika Report Project. And from Brussels, we've got Peter Klepper, head of the Brussels office for Open Europe. Welcome to you all. Valentin, can I start with you in Kiev? Everyone seems to agree that the Prime Minister, his time was up. It was time for him to go. He hadn't done what he was supposed to do. Can you tell us specifically what he failed to do?
Well, the current Prime Minister came when there were great expectations of those who supported the revolution in which he took active part. He had made a lot of promises. One of his promises was creating a miracle that Europe will accept Ukraine will be part of European Union, or at least Europe will provide great assistance to Ukraine and so on. So it was like expecting a miracle from somebody who made a revolution. There were promises to get rid of corruption, to have efficient economy and so on. Nothing has happened, not in institutional sphere, not in legal sphere. Europe is very cautious about approximating Ukraine to its structures, to its economic prosperity. So ordinary people are not much, do not feel sorry for his departure. But what has happened also, that there is a total pessimism about the present development. Most of the people of that half or a little bit more than half who were supporting the overthrow of the previous regime are disillusioned. So for the people now it doesn't matter much who will be the next Prime Minister, even though there is a game that it is said that it is important to change the figures who are prime ministers, and this is what is shown on Ukrainian mass media.
Okay, Valentin,
let's efficient, effective policy.
Let's go to Brussels now then and ask Peter. The main backers of this new Ukrainian project, if you like, is of course the European Union, Europe and the United States. What is Brussels making of the latest developments coming out of Kiev?
Well, Mr. Yatsenyuk may have seen may have been seen as an ally at the beginning of the process, but really what he did was not much. Perhaps even obstructing necessary economic reforms to fight corruption. So it's not a great loss, really. Whether his successor will do much better will remain to be seen, but he's also seen as someone who's not very keen on reforms, unfortunately. More fundamentally, the Georgian wing, Mr. Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, who's also active now politically in Ukraine, I think the best recipe to fight corruption is probably can be witnessed in what happened in Georgia. Basically, what Georgia did was to reduce the scope of the state in the economy. So as a result of that, the people who were managing the big businesses, they actually had a stake in the management of
Peter,
it.
can we get on to possible solutions a little bit later on? In the meantime, let's go to Moscow and ask Vladimir how this is being viewed in the Kremlin. Is there a certain satisfaction in Moscow at the chaos that is afflicting the politics of Kiev today?
I would say that not for the single moment, if we're talking, for instance, about the official Moscow, the Russian authorities, have the events in Kiev been viewed with certain satisfaction. On the contrary, it's really a great tragedy which is evolving just in front of our eyes. And according to all the statements made from Moscow, we are very sorry that the Ukrainian people have actually not managed to get the government and the prime minister that they are entitled to, and certainly are dignified enough to have in place. So the change of guard, the current change of guard, I don't think actually matters much as long as it actually changes the course of its main policies, both internal and external.
That's the official view coming out of Moscow. But what about unofficially? There must be a certain sense of vindication, if you like. They were so against, Russians being so against the process that that part of Ukraine actually underwent.
I would certainly utterly disagree with you for the reason that we regard Ukraine as part of one big family. You don't actually feel satisfied if something bad is happening to your close relatives. And Ukrainians, after all, they are the original Russians if you go deep into the history of our nation. So what is happening to them is taken very emotionally by the people, and by the fact that there are so many Ukrainians living as Russian citizens in Russian Federation, but also you should mention the 7 million Ukrainian citizens who are the so-called zarabotchani, or migrants working in Russia and sending back the remittances. So with so many close ties, we treat it as very emotional, and it's a very sad development which is actually taking place. We certainly, I'm talking the people, let's say if you talk to the people in the street, they feel very emotional, and they certainly would like to see more law and order, and the Ukraine, and especially the authorities, let's put it that way, the political and the business elites in Kiev, finally putting their acts together and coming back to their senses.
All right, Valentin in Kiev, this is about more than one man, isn't it? I mean, you've already mentioned that. The successor has been named as Volodymyr Grossman, currently the Speaker of Parliament. Is he going to fare any better than the man whom he replaces?
So there is a most probable solution that the resignation of the present Prime Minister would be accepted yesterday, and Mr. Grossman will be replacing him. Mr. Grossman is a more balanced person. He is not so radical. In his work record, there are not such things for which Mr. Yatsenyuk can be and is accused now. Like, for example, Mr. Saakashvili, Mikhail Saakashvili, former president of Georgia, who is now an active politician in Ukraine, governor of one of the regions of Ukraine, have mentioned that the present prime minister managed to amass, to earn more than $1 billion during this period. So there was such an accusation. There are many other people who say that, but without proving in detail. So Mr. Groisman cannot be accused of that, of corruption, of inefficiency. Then Mr. Yatsenyuk was one of those who created the situation in the east of Ukraine where we have war, who was unable to go through more peaceful national reconciliation methods. So maybe it's also one of important steps to let some other people, less aggressive, less smart as to their own interests, to come to power as a prime minister and ministers. But there is an important issue that Ukrainian politics are very fluid ones. So Mr. Yatsenyuk several times was saying that he is resigning, but then in the end he continued being prime minister. So I'm not totally sure that tomorrow he will be replaced by somebody else, like Mr. Groisman. There is more chance that he will be replaced, but in Ukraine everything can happen, so let us wait till tomorrow to see what happens.
Okay.
One should remember, in Ukrainian corrupt system, not only political arrangements matter, but sometimes money issues matters. Once, our former speaker, Mr. Moroz, said that Ukrainian parliament was destroyed when first money were brought into the parliament, when members of parliament were paid for some particular decisions.
All right.
So this is one of the aspects.
All right, let's take the point then. The picture that seems to be emerging, Peter, in Brussels, is that the level of corruption is so deeply entrenched in Ukraine that it's going to take a miracle in order to root it all out. But I need to ask you about the fallout from the recent revelations from the Panama Papers, which, of course, incriminate not just the Prime Minister, the President himself. Petro Poroshenko came to power, we all remember, vowing to crush the power of the oligarchs and to institute a certain accountability. And yet his name is now being mentioned with a huge stash, linked with a huge stash of money in offshore accounts.
Exactly. At least it reveals that he, or at least his advisors, were still running businesses, despite the fact that Mr. Poroshenko had promised not to do that. That didn't reflect very well. This also came to the forefront in the Dutch referendum on the EU-Ukraine treaty, which apparently has also been commented on by Tymoshenko, another political foe of Poroshenko. So it all paints the picture of basically an unreformed Ukrainian elite. As much as is it true that Putin and his cronies are intervening there and that they are complicating the situation, we should definitely also blame the Ukrainian elite. Now, what to do about this? I think it's very hard from outside to change much about it, but the one thing that probably should not happen is to keep on transferring IMF money to such a system which is so vulnerable for corruption. And if Ukraine has to default, Ukraine has to default. We've seen that Russia has defaulted. This was obviously very painful on the short term, but it did also do some good on the longer term. One of the reasons why Russia has created some kind of a middle class is that it went through a default, apart from the commodities boom. So that is part of the solution, apart from, of course, also adopting the very successful recipe of Georgia, which is to try to remove the corrupt state out of the economy as much as possible.
All right, let's leave the economy alone for just a little while, because I'd like to look at the security situation. Of course, Ukraine has effectively been divided, with two of its regions now being run by pro-Russia separatists, and indeed one of its regions having been annexed by Russia. So Vladimir, in Moscow, the OSCE has recently reported an upsurge in violations of this tentative ceasefire that's in place. Everybody knows that this is the fighting season in this region. Do you anticipate that Moscow is prepared to offer more support, more succour to those in the eastern part of Ukraine who look to Moscow for support?
The thing is that originally, just going historically, these two regions, that's the Donetsk and Lugansk, have never had any separatist inclinations. Prior to the events in 2014, that means before the Maidan, before the coup d'etat in Kiev, the public opinion polls in these two regions showed that only 15% of the population entertained the idea of joining Russia. Most of the citizens, Ukrainian citizens in these two regions, actually believed in being part and parcel of Ukraine, on one condition, that their democratic rights to having, for instance, democratically elected government and parliament in Kiev, and their right to the Russian language, because most of the majority of the people there speak Russian, would be respected. So that is actually the core problem, the core issue, which has to be settled most probably by abiding by the provisions of the Minsk Accords. For the moment, what I've seen is that the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian battalions, sometimes which was used before, called before the death squads, started once again shelling and bombing civilian targets, civilians in these two regions. Some believe that this is the reflection of the political crisis which is evolving in Kiev itself. It is sort of creating once again the myth of an external threat or the myth of a certain terrorism emanating from these two self-proclaimed republics. As a matter of fact, there have never been an occasion, for instance, there were terrorist acts on the territory of Ukraine or in Kiev. So it's something that has been beefed up in order for propaganda reasons, and once again, given the fact that the political crisis in the capital of the Ukraine is not yet over, there is, I'm afraid, a risk that Kiev or some, let's say, ultra-radical forces might instigate the restart of hostilities in the east of Ukraine.
And Valentin, then, in Kiev, given that the Ukrainian economy is in pretty much free fall, you've got this very volatile security situation with the two breakaway republics and indeed the annexed Crimea. Is it fair to say that the Ukrainian revolution has actually failed?
It depends upon what you understand under the essence of Ukrainian revolution. If you understand it as anti-Russian, pro-Western revolution, it didn't fail, because the leading revolutionaries have created or helped to create the situation when a lot of Ukrainians have anti-Russian sentiment, when Ukraine has broken almost all economic relations and cultural relations with Russia. And in this sense, as anti-Russian nationalistic revolution, it succeeded. But as pro-European, you can hardly say that, because Ukraine didn't become closer to Europe as it was in the time of the previous President Yanukovych, and it didn't manage to create institutions which correspond to European pluralist standards. Ukraine has a partial political democracy. Some segments of its political spectrum are not really represented in the media, as a party system, as movement systems. So in this aspect, there is a lot to do in order to do what was proclaimed by revolutionary, to create a European type system. The end of Ukrainian revolution, when speaking not theoretically but in practical terms, which I see in my own life or my colleagues' life, we receive the same salaries in Ukrainian currency units as it was 3 years ago, but the Ukrainian currency unit is 3 times lower in correlation with euro or with the US dollar. So all people became much poorer. Ukrainian economy is less sustainable now.
Okay. Okay.
If that was the aim, no, it was not, but it is the result. And we need to find a solution, and we need to create national reconciliation. Now Ukraine is a divided society. When there are strong separatist movement in the end, in the east, and we lost one region in the south.
Okay.
So this is the result.
Okay, Peter. Sorry, Peter in Brussels. How much patience does Europe have with the ongoing machinations in Kiev? How much patience will the IMF have? At the moment, it can't pay its debts, and yet it seems to be preparing itself to take on more.
Well, I think the policy elites, they do have a lot of patience, but obviously you cannot keep on postponing the real default, which basically is already being negotiated forever. So I would say let's just get over it, maybe spread it out over a number of years. The result will be that the Kiev government will need to implement more austerity on the short term, but this will also create an incentive to actually rectify a number of corrupt practices, given that there will be
we're running out of
less money.
We're running out of time now, Peter, and I'd like to ask each and every one of you one question, and if you could be brief, it would be very, very helpful. I'll start with you, Peter, in Brussels. Is it possible for a healthy, democratic, pluralistic Ukraine to evolve from the scenario we see now without good relations with Russia, its biggest and arguably its most influential neighbour?
Yeah, well, in the first place, it's definitely possible. If it's possible without good relations, I think it's very important to have good relations with Russia. Indeed, as you say, I think ultimately reality will impose itself. It only makes sense for Russia to have some kind of a working relationship, even if Ukraine would be turning more to the west, like Georgia has.
Okay. Vladimir, can I put the same question to you, and can I ask you to be brief as well? Do you think there is any prospect of Ukraine thriving without the support of Russia?
Given the fact that we actually lived for centuries together, given the fact that from the ethnic point of view we belong to the same Slavonic ethnic family, and taking into account the fact that we have so much in common in terms of the economic ties, political culture, psychological traits of character and all this sort of thing, given that there are so many inter-ethnic marriages, so many relations on both sides of the border, I think the answer is evident. Ukraine can be, and I certainly believe will be, a healthy democratic nation, but once again with very workable, as my previous orator said, but very tight and friendly and even brotherly relationship with Russia. Time heals, and time will actually say its verdict.
Okay, we have 1 minute left on the programme, and Valentin, that minute is for you in Kiev. Do you foresee a scenario by which Ukraine can get itself out of this quagmire at the moment and establish itself either in the European image or perhaps reworking itself and looking further east?
Yeah. In the short term, there will be continuation of the present situation with the change of personalities, but a bit later, Ukraine, with the assistance of the Western powers and with positive reaction from Russia, will have to find national reconciliation program inside the territory controlled by the present Ukrainian authorities, and also involving the eastern part, which has now separatist republics there.
Thank you very much indeed. Valentin Yakushik in Kiev, Vladimir Mikheyev in Moscow, and Peter Klepper in Brussels. Thank you all. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha. It's bye for now.